Welcome to West Film, your home base for movie recaps, reviews, ending breakdowns, and the little details you might have missed in your favorite films. If you love diving deep into great movies, do us a favor and hit subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Now go grab some popcorn, settle in, and let's get into today's movie. The Big Country. A closer look. The performance at the center of this film is impressive precisely because it never tips into excess. From his very first scene, you sense a man accustomed to command, someone who's used to being obeyed without having to raise his voice. That same command shows up in how Major Terrell sizes up Mackay, not through open hostility, but through small glances, clipped remarks, and a tone that makes his skepticism obvious without a word of it being spoken directly. What makes this dynamic compelling is Mackay's response to it. He doesn't bristle or try to justify himself. He simply stays calm, almost detached, and in this particular world, that composure reads as weakness rather than strength. The film never forces this friction into the open. It lets it emerge organically through gesture and tone, which is exactly why it feels so believable. Meanwhile, hints of a much older, deeper conflict start to surface at the long-running feud between the Terrell and Hennessy families. We're not handed the backstory all at once, but it's clear this rivalry runs deep and carries real weight. It isn't simply a property dispute, it's tangled up in pride and history. That context adds another dimension to Mackay's arrival. He isn't just stepping into unfamiliar territory, he's walking straight into somebody else's long-simmering war. The film's restraint is what makes it work. It never rushes toward action or forces a big confrontation. Instead, it lets everything unfold gradually, giving the audience time to actually get to know these people first. The pace may feel unhurried to some viewers, but every scene is quietly doing its job, adding another piece to the larger picture. The cinematography reinforces all of this. Those sweeping shots of the land aren't just scenic flourishes, they underscore how vast and indifferent the landscape is compared to the people fighting over it. However strong these characters' personalities might be, the land dwarfs them, and that scale gives the whole story a grounded sense of realism. The score is used sparingly too. It doesn't hum along constantly in the background, but when it does appear, it lands with real weight, supporting the visuals instead of drowning them out, which keeps the film's tone steady and unshowy. There's also a quiet theme starting to take shape here: competing definitions of strength. In this world, strength usually looks like dominance, aggression, control. Mackay embodies something else entirely: controlled without being aggressive, calm without being weak. The people around him don't quite know what to make of that distinction, and it's this misunderstanding, more than any direct clash, that generates tension. As the opening stretch continues, we see a range of reactions to Mackay: confusion from some, dismissiveness from others, quiet observation from a few. That variety makes the world feel more authentic, since not everyone responds to him the same way. The supporting characters, too, begin to establish themselves, even in small doses. They're not fully fleshed out yet at this point, but they help set the stage and define the social dynamics at play. The casting feels natural throughout, nobody seems miscast or out of place. By the close of this opening section, nothing dramatic has technically happened, but a great deal has been quietly put in place. We understand the setting, the players, and the tension simmering beneath the surface. Above all, we understand that Mackay doesn't fit into this world the way everyone expects him to, and that mismatch is going to matter a great deal as the story develops. Testing Mackay. As the story pushes forward, the film begins testing Mackay in ways that feel earned rather than manufactured, and this is where the gap between him and everyone else really starts to show. One of the earliest and clearest examples comes during a horse riding sequence. On the surface, a simple activity, but it gradually reveals itself as something much more loaded. The other men treat it almost like a contest, pushing their horses hard to display speed, control, and dominance. Mackay rides too, but without any need to prove himself. And that small contrast is enough to set him apart. What's striking is that the scene is never framed as an obvious test, yet clearly it is one. The direction keeps things understated, letting tension emerge from behavior instead of dialogue. Once again, the cinematography does heavy lifting, using wide shots to emphasize how small the riders look against the land, while also capturing motion in a way that feels effortless and unforced. You can see the contrast not just in what people do, but in their whole attitude. Everyone seems to be proving something except Mackay. Major Daryl's reaction is subtle but telling. He doesn't confront Mackay outright, but there's a clear undercurrent of disappointment, as though he expected something different from him. The performance conveys this without needing much dialogue at all, which makes it land more convincingly. It's less about what's said and more about what's felt in the moment. Patricia's situation grows more complicated here too. She understands Mackay's nature, yet she's also part of a world that prizes visible, demonstrable strength. That tension quietly simmers within her. She isn't rejecting him outright, but she isn't defending him either. The performance stays measured and believable throughout these moments. Meanwhile, the Hennessy family starts asserting more of a presence, especially through Buck Hennessy. His personality, aggressive, impulsive, blunt, creates a sharp contrast with Mackay's composure. The film doesn't rush the two of them toward direct conflict, but you can feel it building underneath everything. The direction continues to avoid melodrama. Rather than pushing scenes toward confrontation, it lets them play out in a measured way, which keeps the film's tone consistent and grounded. The pacing stays deliberate, giving these relationships room to develop. There's also a mounting sense that Mackay is under constant scrutiny, not just from Major Terrell, but from everyone around him. Every action, and every inaction, gets noticed. The pressure builds, but subtly it's driven more by expectation than by any open confrontation. The cinematography keeps reinforcing this feeling through its consistent visual language. The wide open landscapes are still central, but now they start to feel isolating, especially for Mackay. He's physically present in this world, yet emotionally and behaviorally, he remains apart from it. The music stays understated, surfacing only when needed, never pulling focus from the scene itself. Sound design continues to lean on natural elements, which keeps the tension rooted in character rather than external effects. As this section unfolds, the theme of strength sharpens into focus. For most characters here, strength means asserting dominance and control. Mackay represents something quieter and more restrained, internal kind of strength that others don't fully grasp, which is precisely why it's so often mistaken for weakness. The film never spells this theme out, it simply lets the audience watch and draw their own conclusions, which adds depth without ever feeling heavy-handed. There's also a growing sense that the larger feud between the Terrells and the Hennessys is inching closer to the surface. It's still not fully revealed, but its presence is felt more strongly now, and no longer a background hum, but something actively shaping the main character's choices. By the end of this stretch, nothing overtly dramatic has occurred, yet the tension has clearly ratcheted up. The characters are more sharply defined, the differences between them are clearer, and the pressure surrounding Mackay keeps building. He's being tested, even if nobody says so outright. And that's exactly what makes this section so important. It shows the conflict isn't purely external. It's also internal, rooted in competing ideas about strength, pride, and control. The feud sharpens as the story continues. The tension that's been quietly accumulating starts to feel far more direct, particularly as the Hennessy family becomes impossible to ignore. This is where the film shows its first real signs of open conflict, though it never abandons its restrained tone. Buck Hennessy's more assertive presence shifts the film's energy entirely. His aggression and impulsiveness sit in stark contrast to Mackay's calm, restrained manner. What's notable is that the film still resists rushing toward confrontation. Instead, tension builds through small exchanges and unspoken challenges. Buck clearly sees Mackay as someone who doesn't belong, and that judgment comes through without any need for direct conflict. The performance carries a raw, natural energy that gives real weight to every scene Buck appears in. Meanwhile, Major Terrell comes into sharper focus. He's no longer just a proud landowner, he's a man deeply entrenched in an ongoing feud built on legacy and control. His animosity toward the Hennessy's isn't just a disagreement, it feels personal, almost like a rivalry that has shaped his entire identity. The direction lets this emerge gradually, without over-explaining it. Mackay, amid all this, continues to stand apart, but now that separateness starts generating real pressure. Where he once simply seemed out of place, his presence starts to feel more actively questioned. There's a mounting expectation that he prove himself, and his refusal to do so in the conventional way only complicates things further. One pivotal moment arrives when Mackay is pushed into a situation where an aggressive response is expected of him, and instead, he stays composed. This matters because it demonstrates that his restraint isn't weakness, it's a deliberate choice. The direction handles this without turning it into a big dramatic beat, which somehow makes it land with even more impact. The cinematography keeps its focus on the interactions between characters rather than visual spectacle. The wide shots are still there, but now there's more attention paid to how people are positioned within those spaces. You can see the distance between them, both physically and emotionally, adding another layer to the tension. Patricia's inner conflict deepens here too. She's beginning to realize that Mackay won't be what her father expects of him, but she's still struggling to fully embrace his outlook. It's a subtle emotional strain, conveyed without any need for the big dramatic scenes. The film also starts exploring pride more directly. For the Terrells and Hennessy's, pride is bound up in land, control, and reputation. For Mackay, it's something quieter. It doesn't need to be put on display. That difference in perspective drives much of the tension in this stretch of the story. The pacing stays steady, but the energy has clearly shifted. This no longer feels like a slow introduction, it feels like the story is moving toward something more defined. The conflict, while still restrained, is no longer buried beneath the surface. Sound design remains minimal, letting tension emerge from the performances and interactions themselves rather than external effects, and the music continues to surface only at key moments, adding weight without ever overwhelming the scene. There's a growing sense that Mackay is starting to understand the world he's in today without changing who he is to fit into it. He holds on to his own way of thinking even when it costs him. That's what makes his character so compelling. He isn't trying to win by the usual rules. He isn't chasing dominance. He's simply declining to play the game at all. By the close of this section, the tension between everyone involved feels far more pronounced. The Hennessy's are no longer a background presence, they're an active force in the story, and the rivalry between the two families feels far more immediate. Mackay's own position grows more precarious too. He's part of this world now, but he still doesn't belong to it the way others expect, and that gap only continues to widen with each passing scene. The Big Muddy. At this point, the story sharpens its focus, especially once the Big Muddy stops being an abstract talking point and becomes something the characters actually experience firsthand. This shift makes the conflict feel tangible and no longer a matter of words or opinions, but something physical that both families are bound to. When Mackay visits the Big Muddy himself, the film's tone shifts slightly. Instead of just hearing about its significance, we finally see it. The cinematography plays a major role here, capturing the land's openness and isolation in a way that makes it feel both precious and empty all at once. What stands out is how Mackay reacts to the place differently from everyone else. For Major Terrell and the Hennessy's, it represents power and control. For Mackay, it feels more like something to be shared than fought over. That difference in perspective grows increasingly important as the story develops, because it reveals that this conflict isn't purely about ownership, it's about how people choose to see the world around them. The direction keeps this scene quiet and understated, letting the landscape speak for itself rather than leaning on heavy dialogue. The performances stay controlled, especially Mackay's. His calm demeanor contrasts sharply with the intensity of the conflicts surrounding the land, and that contrast makes him stand out even more at this stage. There's also a growing sense that Mackay is beginning to act rather than simply observe. Earlier, he seemed like an outsider trying to make sense of everything around him. Now he starts taking small, deliberate steps that show he's willing to act, even when his choices don't follow the expected path. It's a subtle shift, but an important one that marks a real change in his role within the story. Meanwhile, Major Terrill's resolve only hardens. He isn't willing to compromise, and his attachment to the land remains bound up in pride and control. The performance carries real authority, making clear that his decisions are driven by something deeply personal, not just practical necessity, which makes the conflict feel more emotionally charged. Rufus Hennessy becomes a more interesting figure in this stretch as well. Where Buck represents pure aggression, Rufus comes across as more thoughtful and self-aware. He understands the land's value, but he also seems to recognize the cost of this ongoing feud, which adds real depth to his character and complicates the dynamic between the two families. The cinematography continues to emphasize the land's vastness, but now it also highlights the emotional distance between people. Even when characters share the same physical space, you sense they're separated by conflicting motives and worldviews. This visual choice reinforces the emotional tension without needing extra dialogue to spell it out. The sound design stays simple, letting the natural environment shape the atmosphere. The quiet of the location makes the place feel important, almost as though it's waiting to be claimed even though it belongs to no one yet. The music appears sparingly, adding weight at key moments without ever taking over. As this section continues, choice becomes a central idea. Mackay isn't simply reacting to events anymore, he's actively deciding how he wants to exist within this world. But his choices don't align with what others expect of him, and that misalignment generates more friction. Patricia feels this shift too. She starts to realize that Mackay isn't going to change in the way she might once have hoped, and a quiet distance opens up between them, conveyed through performance rather than any dramatic confrontation. The pacing remains measured, but there's a clearer sense of direction now. The stakes no longer feel abstract, they're tied to a specific place, specific people, and choices that can't easily be undone. By the end of this section, the Big Muddy has become more than just land. It's a symbol of everything these characters are fighting for and everything they refuse to relinquish. Mackay's presence in all of this grows more significant because he represents an entirely different way of thinking, one that challenges the very foundation of the conflict. This is the point where the story shifts from observation to involvement, from understanding to actual decision-making. Pressure builds. The tension between Mackay and Major Terrill grows far more pointed now, as what was once a quiet clash of personalities hardens into an open disagreement over values. Terrill no longer just observes Mackay from a distance, he starts questioning him more directly. Even though it never escalates into a loud confrontation, the friction between them becomes far more visible. This shift matters because it shows that Mackay's composure is no longer being overlooked, it's actively being challenged. One of the most striking moments here comes from how Terrill tries to measure Mackay against the same standard he applies to everyone else, where strength means dominance, control, and a willingness to stand your ground. Mackay simply doesn't operate that way, and that mismatch breeds real frustration. The performance conveys that frustration with restraint, which makes it feel more genuine than an exaggerated outburst ever could. Mackay, for his part, remains exactly as consistent as ever, but that consistency now starts to read as resistance. He isn't openly defying Terrill by simply refusing to behave as expected. He's quietly pushing back. This is where his character crystallizes. His strength isn't about reacting to provocation, it's about holding his position without ever compromising who he is. The direction keeps everything grounded, letting the conflict emerge through interaction rather than forced dramatic beats, an approach that keeps the focus squarely on character rather than action. The cinematography reinforces this by framing scenes to emphasize distance and tension between people, even when they occupy the same space. Meanwhile, the Hennessy's keep ratcheting up the pressure. Buck's aggression contrasts even more sharply with Mackay's calm, making every interaction between them feel more charged. Rufus, by contrast, stays composed, and his presence provides some balance, showing that not everyone on that side of the feud is driven purely by impulse. There's also a growing sense that this conflict is becoming harder and harder to sidestep. What was once background noise now shapes nearly every decision the characters make. The Big Muddy remains at the center of it all, but it's evolved into something bigger than land. It's become a test of who's willing to hold their ground, and how far they're prepared to go. Mackay's role in all this grows more complicated. He understands the stakes, yet he still won't engage with the conflict the way everyone else does. That creates a kind of isolation for him, not physical, but rooted in the fact that his way of thinking simply doesn't align with the world around him. Patricia keeps feeling this tension too. She's now acutely aware of the gulf between Mackay and her father, and it grows harder for her to reconcile the two sides. The performance conveys this quietly, without ever tipping into melodrama. The music stays restrained, though its presence grows slightly during key moments, adding weight to the mounting pressure. Sound design continues to draw on natural elements, preserving the film's grounded tone throughout. As this section unfolds, there's a clear shift in the story's overall feel. It's no longer just about understanding the conflict, it's about being caught up in it. Mackay may try to stay an observer, but his choices are already shaping how others perceive him. The cinematography continues to use the landscape effectively, though it starts to feel more confined despite its openness. The wide open spaces no longer feel freeing. Instead, they feel like a place where conflict can spread unchecked, deepening the tension. By the end of this section, the relationship between Mackay and Major Terrell feels distinctly strained, not broken, but clearly under pressure. The expectations placed on Mackay keep intensifying, and his refusal to meet them in the expected way keeps generating friction. Meanwhile, the presence of the Hennessy's ensures this tension isn't confined to one relationship. It's spreading, touching everyone involved, and making it harder for things to stay contained. This marks the point where quiet differences start turning into active conflict, even while it's still being held in check. The duel here, the tension that's been building for so long, finally turns personal, most notably through the relationship between Mackay and Steve Leach. Rather than pushing toward a public confrontation, the film opts for something more private and controlled. Steve, who's been quietly watching Mackay from the start, doesn't see him as weak in the same way others do, but he still has questions. That questioning leads to one of the film's most pivotal moments. What stands out is that this isn't driven by anger or ego in any conventional sense, but by a genuine need to understand. Steve wants to know what Mackay is really made of, and rather than proving it in front of an audience, the two of them agree to settle it privately. That decision alone reveals a lot about both men. It removes the need for public validation and grounds the moment in something more honest. The direction handles this carefully, steering clear of unnecessary drama and keeping the tone consistent with the rest of the film. The duel isn't staged as spectacle, it's framed as a test, which gives it far more meaning. The cinematography supports this by keeping the focus on the two men rather than the action itself, using space and framing to emphasize just how isolated this moment really is. When the confrontation finally happens, it doesn't play out like a typical Western showdown. It's slower, more controlled, built around endurance rather than aggression. Mackay doesn't suddenly transform into someone else, he stays exactly who he's always been. But it's clear he's capable of holding his ground. This is a crucial turning point, because it shows that his calm demeanor isn't all imitation, it's simply a different form of strength. Steve's reaction matters just as much. He starts to see Mackay differently, not as someone avoiding conflict out of fear, but as someone who chooses his battles deliberately. That shift in perception adds new depth to both characters and reshapes the dynamic between them. Meanwhile, the larger feud between the Terrils and Hennessy's keeps building in the background. The duel may be private, but its ripple effects aren't. It changes how Mackay is perceived, and that shift will influence how others respond to him going forward. Major Terril's expectations linger, even though he's not directly involved in this moment. His influence is still felt. He represents a traditional idea of strength rooted in visible dominance, and Mackay's approach keeps chipping away at that notion. The cinematography continues to emphasize isolation here, especially during the duel itself, where the vast landscape makes the moment feel even more intimate and personal. The wide shots are still present, but now they highlight just how alone these two men are in that instant. Sound design stays minimal, letting silence carry the emotional weight of the scene. Nothing distracts from it. When the music does surface, it's subtle, reinforcing the emotion rather than overpowering it. As this section unfolds, respect starts replacing judgment, at least for some. Steve's shift in perspective is the clearest example, but it hints that others may come to see Mackay differently too. Patricia is affected as well, even indirectly. The widening gap between her expectations and Mackay's reality grows harder to ignore, adding another layer to their relationship. The pacing stays steady, but something has clearly changed. The story is no longer just building tension, it's starting to resolve some of the earlier misunderstandings. By the end of this stretch, the duel stands out as a genuine turning point, not because it's dramatic, but because it reshapes how Mackay is seen. He's no longer just the outsider who doesn't fit in, he's someone who chooses his own path, even when it defies expectation. That shift sets the stage for what comes next, as the conflict moves beyond personal perception and into something larger and unavoidable. Toward the breaking point, the story grows heavier here, because the tension is no longer confined to individuals. It starts spreading across both families in a way that destabilizes everything. What was once contained and controlled now feels close to breaking, especially as the feud between the Terrils and Hennessy's becomes impossible to overlook. The film never turns loud outright, but there's a clear shift in energy. You can feel things moving towards something far more serious. One of the most noticeable changes is how the situation begins affecting everyone, not just the central characters. The feud is no longer background noise, it's shaping decisions, reactions, and relationships throughout. Major Terrill grows more rigid in his stance, his need for control feeling stronger than ever. The performance still carries that authority, but now there's a strain behind it, as though holding on to control is becoming genuinely difficult. On the other side, the Hennessy's grow more volatile too, particularly through Buck, whose aggression pushes things closer to open conflict. His actions feel less restrained now, and that lack of discipline only deepens the tension. Rufus, meanwhile, still maintains a more measured approach, and that contrast within his own family adds further complexity to the story. Mackay's position grows even more complicated here. After the duel, people see him differently, but that doesn't mean he's fully accepted. If anything, people seem unsure how to categorize him now. He's proven he isn't weak, yet he still refuses to play by the established rules, and that creates its own distinct kind of tension. What's compelling is that Mackay doesn't adjust his behavior to fit in. Even after earning a measure of respect, he continues acting with the same calm, controlled demeanor. That consistency becomes one of his defining traits, and it makes him stand out even more as the conflict intensifies. The direction stays grounded even as the stakes climb. Rather than turning the story into a string of dramatic confrontations, it lets tension build through interactions and decisions, which keeps the film focused and consistent in tone. The cinematography reflects this shift too. The wide landscapes are still there, but they feel less open now, more charged, as though the same space that once felt calm now holds real conflict within it. Scenes are often framed to place characters at a distance from one another, visually underscoring the divide between them. Patricia feels this more intensely in this stretch. She's now fully aware of the gap between Mackay and her father, and it creates a deeper emotional strain for her. She wants both sides to reconcile, but it's becoming obvious that isn't possible. The performance captures this internal struggle subtly, without tipping into melodrama. Sound design continues to rely on natural elements, but tension builds slightly through the use of silence. Moments without sound now carry more weight, hinting at what's coming. The music stays controlled, surfacing only when needed to support key beats. As the story progresses, the conflict over the Big Muddy starts feeling more urgent. It's no longer just about who owns the land. It feels like a flashpoint that could ignite something bigger if it isn't resolved. Neither side is willing to back down. Mackay's role in all this grows more important because he represents an alternative way of thinking, though that also makes him stand out even more in a world not yet ready to accept that difference. His calm approach starts to feel almost like a direct challenge to the system around him. The Hennessy side of the conflict finds its own form of resolution, not through victory or defeat, but through the recognition that the old way of doing things simply can't continue. Rufus embodies this shift especially well, his more balanced perspective carrying real weight in these final moments. Patricia finds her own clarity as well. Her journey has always been tied to the expectations of her world, but everything she's witnessed leads her to see things differently by the end. Her connection with Mackay feels more honest here, grounded in understanding rather than expectation. The cinematography continues to reflect the ending's tone through its familiar wide-open visuals, though the landscapes now feel calmer. Where they once carried tension and conflict, they now feel like a space where everything has finally settled, a shift that reinforces the film's sense of closure. Sound design stays subtle, letting silence carry much of the emotional weight, while the music, whenever it appears, supports the tone without ever dominating it, staying true to the film's grounded sensibility throughout. What makes the ending so effective is that it doesn't try to wrap everything up neatly or dramatically. Instead, it focuses on the journey itself and what's changed along the way. The characters aren't completely transformed, but they've evolved enough for the story to feel complete. The pacing in these final moments stays unhurried, giving the audience plenty of room to absorb everything that's happened. There's no rush to conclude, which lets the ending feel entirely natural. Mackay's presence in these closing scenes feels distinctly different from where he started. He's no longer the outsider struggling to understand this world. He's someone who's found his place in it without ever compromising who he is. That's what gives his journey real meaning. The film also leaves a degree of openness in its conclusion. It doesn't tie up every loose end, but it offers enough to feel whole. That choice works because it honors the tone the film has maintained all along. By the end, the story feels less about the conflict itself and more about what that conflict revealed about the people caught up in it. The feud, the land, the struggle for control, all of it mattered, but it also served as a lens for exploring deeper questions about strength, pride, and understanding. That's precisely what makes the ending land so well. It stays consistent with everything that came before it, delivering a conclusion that feels earned rather than forced. Looking at the film as a whole, stepping back and considering the film in full, what lingers isn't just the story, but the way it's told. This isn't a movie that depends on big twists or non-stop action. It builds its impact through consistency, atmosphere, and character. And that's exactly what gives it its identity. The journey never feels like a string of dramatic set pieces, it feels like something that develops gradually, each moment building on the last without straining to stand out on its own. One of the film's greatest strengths is how it handles its characters, especially Mackay, whose arc feels complete not because he transforms into someone else, but because he remains himself in a world that expects otherwise. That consistency becomes his defining strength, and the performance conveys it with restraint, never leaning on theatrics, which is exactly what makes the character so believable. Major Terrell adds a great deal to the film as well, representing an entirely different kind of strength rooted in control and authority. The performance gives the role real weight without ever tipping into excess, and that balance is essential, since it keeps the conflict grounded. Even when his worldview is challenged, he doesn't suddenly change, which keeps the character feeling authentic. The supporting cast plays a crucial role in shaping the story too. Patricia adds real emotional depth, especially in how she navigates two conflicting worlds, while the Hennessy family, particularly Rufus and Buckeye, represent two very different responses to the same underlying conflict. The casting works well across the board, with every character feeling like a natural part of the film's world. From a production standpoint, the film stands out for how it uses its environment. The land isn't just a backdrop, it functions as an active participant in the story. Those wide open spaces add scale, but they also generate a sense of isolation that reinforces the film's emotional tone. The cinematography leans into this by prioritizing framing and space over visual complexity, keeping everything clear and purposeful. The direction stays consistent from start to finish, never pushing the film into territory it isn't suited for. It remains grounded, focused on character and atmosphere throughout, and that discipline is what makes the story feel complete. There's no unnecessary padding, no forced drama, just a steady, intentional progression. The music and sound design reinforce this tone as well. Rather than relying on constant scoring, the film leans on silence and natural sound to build atmosphere. When music does appear, it supports the moment rather than overtaking it, keeping the story front and center. Another notable quality is how the film handles its themes. It doesn't spell everything out, it trusts the audience to piece things together through observation. Ideas about strength, pride, and control are explored through behavior rather than dialogue, which gives the film depth without ever feeling weighed down. The pacing, which may feel unhurried to some, is actually one of the film's core strengths. It gives the story room to develop naturally, letting the audience connect with the characters and the world around them, which makes the overall experience more engaging even without constant action. By the end, the film feels complete without relying on tidy answers or a dramatic finale. It feels like a journey that's reached a natural point of understanding rather than one that's simply concluded, and that's what makes it endure, staying true to its tone from beginning to end. Performances and production. What really sets the film apart is how confidently it commits to its own pace and identity. This isn't a movie chasing trends or trying to dazzle through non-stop action. It builds its impact slowly, and by the time it reaches its conclusion, you realize every choice was made to deliver this feeling of quiet completeness. It isn't loud or overly dramatic, but it stays with you precisely because of how controlled and consistent it is. Mackay's journey feels meaningful not because he becomes someone else, but because he never needed to. That idea only grows stronger when you consider the performance itself. Gregory Peck brings such a calm, natural presence to the role that you can almost forget how much of the film rests on his shoulders. There's no exaggeration, no forced intensity, just a steady, understated performance that fits the story's tone perfectly. Charlton Heston, as Major Terrell, brings an entirely different energy, a more commanding and authoritative, and that contrast between the two performances is one of the film's strongest assets. It's not just about conflict within the story, it's about two distinct acting styles representing two fundamentally different worldviews. From a production standpoint, The film was made on a substantial scale for its era, particularly given its emphasis on real locations and sweeping landscapes. Its budget is estimated at around $2.8 million, a significant sum at the time, and that investment clearly shows up in the cinematography and the scope of its outdoor sequences. The film also performed well commercially, earning roughly $31 million worldwide, a major success for its time. What's even more notable is that its value never stopped at the box office over the years. It's become known for its distinctive storytelling approach and its take on the Western genre. The cinematography deserves particular recognition, since it's one of the defining elements of the film. Those wide shots of the land aren't purely decorative, they reinforce the story by illustrating just how small these characters are against the world they're fighting to control. This visual approach adds meaning without ever needing extra explanation. The score, composed by Jerome Moross, also plays a significant role in giving the film its distinct identity. It isn't used constantly, but when it enters, it brings a real sense of scale and emotion that complements the visuals perfectly. It's also worth noting how the film pushes against typical Western conventions. Rather than centering solely on action and confrontation, it explores ideas like pride, control, and competing definitions of strength, giving it more depth than many films of its era. Even the supporting cast contributes to this without ever pulling focus from the main story. The way all these elements come together shows just how carefully the film was constructed. From today's vantage point, the pacing might feel slow to some viewers, but watching with patience reveals how every scene contributes to the larger experience. It isn't trying to rush you, it's asking you to stay with it. By the time it ends, there's no grand dramatic climax, just a genuine sense of understanding. You see how the characters have changed, how the conflict has shaped them, and how everything comes together naturally. That's ultimately what makes The Big Country stand out even now, a proof that a film doesn't need constant action or heavy drama to leave a real impression. Sometimes all it takes is consistency, strong performances, and a clear creative vision, direction and craft. Looking beyond the plot, it becomes clear just how carefully constructed this film is, particularly in terms of direction and visual storytelling. This isn't a movie built on quick cuts or rapid pacing to hold your attention. It relies on patience, and that patience is what gives it such a distinctive identity. Director William Wyler keeps everything under tight control from start to finish, never letting the film lose its focus. And that consistency is what makes the whole experience feel unified. One thing that becomes more apparent the longer you sit with the film is how it handles space, not just physically, but emotionally. The wide landscapes aren't only there to convey scale, they actively create distance between characters, making the conflicts between them feel even more isolating. This is where the cinematography transcends mere visuals and becomes part of the storytelling itself. The use of real locations rather than artificial sets reinforces this feeling. Everything looks authentic, and that realism helps the audience connect more directly with the world on screen. It never feels staged, it feels like you're witnessing something that could exist well beyond the frame. The film also sidesteps typical Western cliché copyright S. Rather than focusing purely on gunfights and action, it invests time in building characters and relationships, which gives the eventual conflict real weight when it finally arrives, because it's been earned over time. The performances remain central to all of this. Gregory Peck keeps his portrayal steady and controlled throughout, never breaking from the film's overall tone, while Charlton Heston brings genuine intensity without ever tipping into excess. That balance between restraint and dominance drives much of the film's underlying tension. Technically, the film also stands out for its use of sound and silence. Rather than filling every moment with music, it lets scenes breathe, which makes the emotional beats feel more natural. Jerome Moros's score supports the film without ever controlling it. There's also something notable in how the film handles time. It never rushes through events or artificially accelerates the pacing for the audience's sake. This unhurried rhythm might feel unusual at first, but it allows the story to unfold in a way that feels genuinely realistic. The production design deserves credit too. Even though the film looks simple on the surface, there's real attention to detail in how everything is arranged, from costumes to buildings to the overall environment, all of which contribute to a believable world. The film also handles its themes without ever spelling them out directly. It shows rather than tells. The concept of strength, for instance, gets presented in multiple forms through different characters, and the audience is left to decide which version resonates most. Historically speaking, the film also marks a shift in how westerns were made, moving away from simple good versus evil narratives toward more complex characters and situations, a distinction that sets it apart even compared to other films of its era. The editing style reinforces this tone too, favoring smooth, consistent cuts over rapid editing designed to manufacture excitement, which helps preserve the overall atmosphere. The more you think about the film, the clearer it becomes that its real strength lies in how well all these individual elements work together. Nothing feels out of place, and everything supports the central story. Even after the main conflict resolves, the film leaves you with something to sit with, which isn't always true of films in this genre. It doesn't offer a perfect ending, but it delivers a complete experience. The pacing stays steady, but there's a clear sense that things are heading toward a breaking point. The tension is no longer subtle, it's present in nearly every scene, even when it's not spoken aloud. By the end of this section, the story feels like it's reached a stage where something has to give. The pressure has built to a level that can't stay contained much longer, setting the ground for the next phase, where the conflict will finally spill into the open and its consequences will become impossible to ignore. The kidnapping the story takes a darker turn now, and the tension that's been building finally produces real consequences, most notably through the kidnapping of Julie Marrigan, which shifts the entire direction of the conflict. Up to this point, the rivalry between the Terrells and the Hennessy's had mostly been fueled by pride and control. Now it becomes personal and dangerous, because an innocent person is directly caught up in it. What matters here isn't just the event itself, but how it changes the film's tone. The situation is no longer contained. There's a real sense that things have gone too far. The direction handles this shift carefully, avoiding unnecessary theatrics while still making the impact land. Julie becomes a more significant presence here, not because she suddenly takes over the story, but because her situation highlights the human cost of this feud. She represents a quieter, more grounded thread within the narrative, and what happens to her makes clear that this conflict isn't just about power, it affects real lives. Mackay's reaction differs from what everyone expects. While Major Terrell and his men are ready to respond with force, Mackay approaches things in a far more measured, thoughtful way. This difference reinforces, once again, how differently these characters handle conflict. There's a strong sense that Mackay understands the situation on a deeper level. He recognizes that meeting aggression with more aggression will only make things worse, but he also can't remain passive. That balance makes his character feel more fully realized than before. Major Terrell's response, by contrast, is driven by pride and urgency. He sees the kidnapping as a direct challenge to his authority, and his reaction reflects his need to maintain control. The performance still carries that same authority, but now there's real pressure behind it. The Hennessy's, especially Buck, become more dangerous in this stretch. His actions grow less restrained, adding to the overall tension, while Rufus, still relatively composed, seems affected by just how far things have escalated. The cinematography reflects this darker tone through tighter framing and less reliance on wide-open spaces. The landscape is still present, but it now feels less calm and more threatening, as though the same environment that once felt expansive now carries a weight of its own. Sound design shifts subtly too, using silence more deliberately to build unease. The absence of sound in key moments makes everything feel more charged, and when music does appear, it supports the emotional stakes without becoming overwhelming. Patricia is deeply affected by this turn of events as well. She's no longer simply observing the conflict, she's emotionally entangled in it now, and her reaction adds another dimension to the story, showing how this feud is damaging relationships as much as individuals. As things develop, there's a growing sense that the conflict has crossed a threshold it can't return from. The kidnapping forces every character to confront the real consequences of their actions. Mackay's role becomes more central here, because he represents a different way of approaching the crisis, motivated not by pride or anger, but by a desire to resolve things without causing further harm. That sets him apart from everyone else even more sharply. The pacing stays controlled, but the stakes feel considerably higher than before. Every decision now carries weight, and the tension is no longer about what might happen, it's about what's already happening. By the end of this section, it's clear the story has entered a new phase. The conflict is no longer distant or abstract, it's immediate, personal, and its consequences are already visible. The story now enters its most intense stretch, as the situation with Julie can no longer be delayed, forcing both sides into action even though they approach it in entirely different ways. The tension that had been slowly accumulating now feels immediate, and every decision carries far more weight. Major Daryl's response grows more aggressive here. He's no longer interested in control through authority alone, he wants action, and his approach reflects the same mindset that's driven this conflict from the very beginning. For him, this isn't only about rescuing Julie, it's also about defending his position and proving that he can't be challenged. The performance carries that same intensity, but now it feels heavier, as though the pressure has finally reached a breaking point. Mackay, however, continues to approach things differently. He understands that charging in with force could make matters worse, which puts him directly at odds with Daryl's plan. What's interesting is how the film conveys this disagreement without turning it into an explicit argument. How the tension exists, but it's expressed through choices rather than words. There's a clear sense that Mackay is thinking several steps ahead, searching for a way to resolve the situation without escalating it further. That approach fits his character perfectly, but it also complicates his position, because the world around him simply doesn't operate that way. Meanwhile, cracks start appearing within the Hennessy family's own dynamic. Buck's aggression now creates problems rather than solving them, and even Rufus seems to recognize that things are spiraling out of control. This internal friction adds another layer to the story, showing that the conflict isn't as simple as two sides squaring off against each other. The cinematography grows slightly more focused on movement and positioning as the rescue takes shape. The wide landscapes remain, but there's more attention paid to how characters navigate them, lending a sense of urgency without rushing the scenes themselves. Sound design leans into a bit more intensity while staying controlled overall. The music builds tension carefully without ever taking over, and silence continues to play a major role, especially in moments where the outcome hangs in the balance. Patricia is now fully caught up in the situation. Her emotional involvement becomes more visible, though it's still conveyed with restraint. She isn't merely reacting, she's actively processing everything unfolding around her, which adds real depth to her character. As the rescue gets underway, the film resists turning it into a conventional action sequence. Instead, it keeps its focus on the characters and their choices. The tension stems from uncertainty rather than spectacle, which suits the film's overall tone perfectly. Mackay's role becomes increasingly central here, since his approach starts shaping how events actually unfold. He isn't trying to dominate or control the outcome, he's trying to resolve it, and that distinction becomes more important as the story reaches its peak. There's also a mounting sense that the rivalry between these two families can't continue as it has after this. The situation with Julie has pushed things too far, and even those clinging to the old ways are starting to feel its impact. The pacing stays steady, but the energy is unmistakably higher. Every scene feels more consequential now, since the story is finally moving toward the resolution it's been building toward all along. By the end of this section, tension has reached its peak. The rescue is no longer just an idea, it's happening, and its outcome will affect everyone involved. The conflict has reached a point of no return, and that's exactly what makes this section so powerful. It brings everything that's been building to a head and pushes the story toward a moment where change becomes unavoidable. Aftermath: what follows the rescue carries a different kind of weight, because even as the immediate danger subsides, the emotional fallout from everything that's happened doesn't simply disappear. This is where the film pivots its focus from action back to character, in a deliberately controlled way. The situation with Julie may be resolving, but the broader consequences of the conflict are more visible than ever. The outcome of the rescue isn't treated as a straightforward victory. Instead, it feels like a moment that exposes just how far things had gone and how much damage has already been done. The direction handles this carefully, avoiding any sense of triumph and keeping the tone reflective and grounded, a choice that makes the moment feel more honest, since it acknowledges that this conflict can't simply be undone by resolving one crisis. Mackay's role here grows even more meaningful, because his approach has clearly diverged from everyone else's, and that difference starts to shape how others perceive him. He didn't act out of pride or anger, and because of that, his actions carry a different kind of resonance. The performance stays restrained, but there's a quiet strength in how he carries himself after everything that's transpired. Major Terrill, meanwhile, begins to feel the weight of the situation in a more personal way. His authority is still intact, but it no longer feels as unshakable as it once did. There's a sense that recent events have challenged his worldview, even if he won't openly admit it. The performance conveys this shift subtly, keeping the character believable rather than suddenly transformed. The Hennessy's also face the fallout of their actions. Buck's aggression, once mistaken for a sign of strength, now feels like a liability, and even within the family there's a growing sense that things can't continue as they have been. Rufus stays composed, but he's clearly shaken by how the situation unfolded. The cinematography adopts a quieter tone here, favoring stillness over movement. The wide landscapes remain, but now they feel more reflective than overwhelming, as though the environment itself is absorbing everything that's happened. Sound design leans further into silence, letting those quiet stretches carry real emotional weight and giving the audience space to process events. The music stays subtle, surfacing only to support the tone of a given scene. Patricia is profoundly affected by all of this too. Her perspective begins to shift, particularly in how she views Mackay and her father. As the emotional distance between her and the world she comes from grows more pronounced, adding depth to her character without requiring dramatic exposition. As the story moves through this stretch, it becomes clear the conflict was never just about land or control. It's about the cost of clinging to those ideas for too long. The characters are now grappling with the consequences of their choices, and that shift changes the entire tone of the film. Mackay's presence becomes even more significant here, since he represents a path forward that isn't rooted in dominance or pride. His actions have demonstrated an alternative way of handling conflict, even if it isn't immediately embraced by everyone else. The pacing stays steady, but there's a sense the story is moving into its final stage. The tension hasn't vanished, but it's transformed. It's no longer about what might happen, but about what already has, and what comes next. By the end of this section, the film feels notably more reflective. The characters are no longer simply reacting, they're beginning to grasp the impact of their actions, even if they aren't fully ready to change. This marks the transition from conflict to consequence, setting up how the story will ultimately resolve toward resolution. At this stage, the film begins preparing for its final act, and you can feel the story moving toward resolution, not in a rushed or dramatic fashion, but in a thoughtful, controlled way that stays true to its overall tone. The conflict remains present, but it no longer feels chaotic. Instead, everything seems to be settling into place, even if the characters themselves aren't fully aware of it yet. What stands out here is how the focus shifts from reaction to decision. Earlier, the characters were mostly responding to circumstances. Now they're actively choosing how to move forward, which makes every moment feel more consequential. The direction keeps things grounded, letting these decisions carry weight without forcing emotional intensity. Mackay's character reaches a point of full clarity. He's no longer simply observing or reacting, he's actively shaping the outcome, even if he does so in his own quiet way. His approach stays consistent, but it now feels more impactful because it's been tested throughout the entire story. Major Terrill, meanwhile, starts confronting the reality of the situation more directly. His sense of control persists, but it's no longer as dominant as it once was. There's a sense that he's beginning to understand the conflict can't continue as before, even if he struggles to accept that fully. The performance captures this shift without ever making it too obvious, keeping the character grounded. The Hennessy's show signs of change too, especially through Rufus, whose more balanced outlook feels increasingly meaningful compared to Buck's earlier aggression. The contrast between the two sides remains, but it now leans less toward opposition and more toward resolution. The cinematography reflects this transition by keeping its wide-open visual style while introducing a sense of calm. The landscape, once a source of tension, now feels more neutral and no longer the center of conflict, but simply the space where everything has played out. Sound design continues relying on subtlety, with silence still shaping the atmosphere, while the music appears sparingly, adding emotional weight to key beats without overpowering them, keeping the tone consistent with the rest of the film. Patricia reaches an important turning point here too. She starts seeing things more clearly, especially the gap between her expectations and what reality has actually shown her. Her connection to Mackay becomes more defined, not through dramatic declarations, but through genuine understanding. As the story moves forward, resolution becomes more central, though it's never presented as something simple. The film refuses easy answers, which is exactly what makes it feel realistic. The characters aren't suddenly transformed, but they've clearly been shaped by everything that's happened. Mackay's presence becomes the key element in this transition, since he represents a way of handling conflict that doesn't depend on force or dominance, an approach that once seemed out of place but now feels genuinely relevant. The pacing stays steady, but there's a growing sense of closure. The tension hasn't disappeared entirely, but it's no longer driving the story the way it once did. Instead, everything seems to be moving toward understanding rather than confrontation. By the end of this section, everything feels more focused. The conflict has been explored, the characters have been tested, and the story is finally ready to bring it all together in a way that feels earned rather than forced. The ending, as the film moves into its closing moments, everything that's been building comes together in a way that feels calm rather than explosive, and that restraint is exactly what makes the ending so memorable. Rather than leaning on a dramatic climax, the film stays true to its tone, focusing on how the characters have been changed by everything they've been through. The conflict is still there, but it no longer needs to be fought the same way. Mackay's arc reaches its natural conclusion here, not because he's seized control in any conventional sense, but because he's remained consistent from beginning to end. What once looked like weakness is now understood as genuine strength, and that shift in perception is what gives his character real closure. The performance conveys this quietly, without needing a single big moment to prove the point. Major Terrill reaches his own moment of realization too. even if it's never stated outright. The events of the story have clearly challenged his worldview, and while he may not undergo a complete transformation, there's a sense that he now sees things differently. That subtle shift adds real depth to his character and gives the ending a grounded feel. Beyond the genre, looking a little deeper, it becomes clear the film isn't simply telling a story about land or conflict. It's exploring competing ideas of strength and identity, which is exactly what sets it apart from so many other westerns of its time. Most westerns lean on action, quick decisions, and clearly defined heroes and villains. Here, the lines are far less distinct, and the film takes its time making that clear. What's compelling about this approach is how it reshapes your expectations. At first, you might anticipate Mackay eventually embracing the more aggressive, dominant posture of a typical Western hero, but that transformation never comes. Instead, the film stays true to his character, and that choice gives the story a very different kind of impact. Comparing this to other westerns from the same era makes the difference even clearer. Many rely on brisk pacing and direct conflict to hold an audience's attention, but this film leans on patience and atmosphere instead, prioritizing character behavior over action, which gives it a more grounded feel throughout. William Wyler's direction plays a huge role in shaping this identity. He never chases convention, and that confidence lets the film stay consistent from beginning to end. Maintaining that level of control isn't easy, especially in a genre so often built around action. The performances reinforce this deeper approach as well. Gregory Peck continues to carry the film with a calm, steady presence, while Charlton Heston embodies a more traditional notion of strength, and the contrast between the two becomes even more meaningful when viewed through this lens. The film's use of silence and space to convey meaning is another notable element. Rather than explaining everything through dialogue, it allows certain moments to exist wordlessly, and those moments often communicate more than any conversation could. This demands patience from the audience, but it also makes the payoff more rewarding. The cinematography reinforces this through wide shots that emphasize distance and isolation. The land is a constant presence, but never merely a backdrop. It actively shapes the characters and their choices. There's also a deeper layer in how the film approaches conflict itself. It isn't only about winning or losing, it's about reckoning with the cost of clinging to certain beliefs. Both families are driven by pride, and that pride ultimately produces consequences that ripple far beyond the people directly involved. Viewed this way, the film feels less like a traditional story and more like a study of human behavior, how people respond under pressure, how they cling to their convictions, and how those convictions can shift over time. Jerome Ross's score reinforces this feeling too, supporting the emotional tone without ever seizing control of it, giving the film a real sense of scale while still letting its quieter moments stand on their own. Another notable quality is how much the film respects its audience. It doesn't over-explain nor manipulate your emotional response. It gives you room to think and interpret for yourself. That approach won't land for everyone, especially viewers expecting a faster pace or more action. But for those who appreciate a more deliberate, thoughtful style, it offers something genuinely different. The more you reflect on the film, the clearer it becomes that its real strength lies in its consistency. It never tries to become something else, and it never loses sight of its core ideas, which is exactly what makes it more than just a Western. It's something that transcends the genre, offering a richer, more thoughtful experience. Lasting impact. Considering how the film connects with audiences, one thing becomes obvious: its impact depends heavily on how you approach it. This isn't a movie built to grab your attention instantly. It asks for patience, and in return it delivers a far more complete and thoughtful experience. Viewers expecting a faster pace or more action might find it slow at first, but once you settle into its rhythm, it grows genuinely engaging. What's interesting about the film's reception is that it never tries to please everyone. It commits to its own tone and trusts that the audience who connects with it will appreciate what it's doing. That confidence is part of what gives it lasting value. It never feels tethered to a specific trend or fleeting style. Over time, the film has earned a strong reputation, not just as a Western, but as something that offers a genuinely different take on the genre. By stepping away from purely action-driven storytelling in favor of character and atmosphere, it continues to stand out even decades after its release. Much of that legacy is tied to the performances. Gregory Peck delivers a role that feels understated yet powerful, and that kind of restraint tends to age well, since it never depends on exaggeration. Charlton Heston, meanwhile, represents a more traditional style, and the contrast between the two remains one of the film's most memorable qualities. William Wyler's direction is equally central to its lasting impact. His ability to keep the film consistent from start to finish is what makes it feel complete, and even when the pacing slows, the film never seems to lose its grip. The cinematography remains one of its most discussed elements, particularly in how it uses space. The wide landscapes aren't just visually striking, they add real meaning to the story by illustrating how small the characters are against their surroundings. The film's themes are another reason it remains relevant. Questions of pride, control, and competing definitions of strength aren't tied to a specific era or setting, which allows the film to resonate with new audiences over time. Jerome Ross's score contributes to this longevity too, giving the film a distinctive musical identity that still feels recognizable decades later. From a modern perspective, the film may feel quite different from today's faster, more visually driven movies, but that very difference is part of its appeal. It offers an experience built around observation and understanding rather than constant stimulation. The pacing, which might seem slow initially, becomes one of its greatest strengths once you settle into it, allowing the story to unfold naturally and giving the audience time to connect with its characters. The film's influence on other movies is another important part of its legacy. By centering character and atmosphere over pure spectacle, it helped demonstrate that Westerns could be more than simple action stories, opening the door for more layered storytelling within the genre. The supporting cast reinforces this legacy too. Every character feels like a genuine part of this world rather than mere background presence, and that attention to detail helps create a fuller, more complete experience. Looking at the film today, it feels like something made with a clear, deliberate vision, and that clarity is exactly what has allowed it to remain relevant. It doesn't depend on trends, which is precisely why it still resonates. Its value extends well beyond its plot. It lies in how it continues to connect with people over time and how it keeps offering something meaningful to those who watch it. A confident vision taking a broader view. What really distinguishes this film is how confident it is in its own approach. It never feels like it's competing with other movies or chasing a formula. It simply commits to telling its story in a way that stays true to its characters. That kind of confidence is rare, especially in a genre so often built on familiar patterns. One of the film's most important achievements is how it redefines what strength can look like. Rather than presenting strength as something loud or aggressive, it shows that it can also exist in a far quieter form, and this is exactly where Mackay's character matters most. He never adapts to fit the world around him, and that consistency becomes his defining trait. At the same time, the film never frames one perspective as entirely right or wrong. Major Terrill's approach may feel harsh, but it's rooted in genuine experience and hard-won control, while the Hennessy's represent a more chaotic, impulsive counterpoint. This balance keeps the conflict feeling realistic, rather than reducing it to clearly defined sides. William Wyler's direction remains one of the film's strongest assets throughout, keeping everything grounded and focused. Even as the story moves toward its most intense moments, it never loses its underlying tone. The performances stay central to this impact. Gregory Peck carries the film with a natural, calming presence, while Charlton Heston adds a strong contrast through his more commanding energy. The tension between these two dynamics drives much of the story forward. The cinematography also plays a major role in shaping how the film is experienced. Its use of wide, open spaces adds scale while also creating a sense of isolation that mirrors the emotional distance between characters. Another notable strength is how carefully the film paces itself. It never rushes, and it never manufactures excitement artificially. Instead, it lets tension build organically, which makes the moments of actual conflict feel far more meaningful. The film's themes continue to resonate, largely because they're conveyed with such subtlety. Ideas about pride, control, and understanding come through action rather than dialogue, which makes them feel more authentic. Jerome Ross's score reinforces this tone, adding emotional depth without ever becoming overwhelming. From a modern vantage point, the film may feel quite different from today's fast-paced storytelling. But that difference is exactly what gives it lasting value. It delivers an experience centered on observation and character rather than non-stop action. The supporting characters add to this depth as well, each contributing something meaningful to the story without ever pulling focus from the central narrative, which keeps the whole film cohesive. Reflecting on all of this, it becomes clear the film isn't just about its plot, it's about how that plot is delivered and what it prompts you to think about. That's precisely why it continues to stand out even decades later, not because of what happens, but because of how it's told. A complete journey when everything finally settles and you consider the film as a whole. What stays with you most is how consistent it feels from beginning to end. It never shifts its tone nor tries to become something else purely for effect. It opens in a calm, controlled register and closes the same way, which makes the entire experience feel unified rather than fragmented. One of the film's greatest strengths is that it doesn't rely on big dramatic beats to leave a lasting impression. Instead, it builds everything gradually, letting the audience come to understand the characters and their motivations over time. That approach might feel unusual next to faster-paced films, but it's exactly what gives the story its depth. Mackay's arc feels complete in a genuinely natural way, because he never needs to prove himself through actions that go against his nature. From the very start, he embodies a different kind of strength, and by the end, that strength is understood rather than questioned. Gregory Peck carries the role with a performance that feels steady and grounded, never forcing emotion, which makes the character all the more believable. Charlton Heston, as Major Terrill, represents a more traditional notion of strength rooted in control and authority, and the contrast between these two men remains one of the film's defining elements, and either presented as entirely right, which keeps the story feeling balanced. William Wyler's direction is ultimately what holds it all together. His ability to sustain a consistent tone as the story develops is what makes the film feel whole. There are no jarring shifts, no unnecessary additions, just a clear, focused approach from beginning to end. The cinematography remains a defining feature throughout, using space in a way that adds real meaning to the story. The wide landscapes aren't just visually striking, they also reflect the emotional distance between characters and the scale of the conflict itself. Jerome Ross's score enhances this experience by supporting the tone without overpowering it, giving the film its own identity while still letting the quieter moments breathe. The film also handles its themes without spelling them out directly, letting the audience arrive at ideas about pride, control, and differing notions of strength through observation. This makes the experience more engaging, since you're not just watching the story unfold, you're actively thinking about it. The supporting characters help keep the story grounded as well. None of them feel superfluous, and each contributes something meaningful to the overall narrative. From a production standpoint, the film demonstrates just how effective simplicity can be when it's handled with care. It doesn't lean on complex visuals or excessive detail. It uses what it has in a way that feels complete. The pacing, which might feel slow at first, becomes one of the film's greatest strengths, giving the story time to develop and allowing the audience to connect with it on a deeper level. By the end, the film doesn't leave you with a loud or dramatic conclusion, but with a genuine sense of understanding. Everything feels like it's reached a natural point rather than being forced toward a specific ending. And honestly, that's exactly what makes The Big Country endure even today. A proof that a film doesn't need constant action or heavy drama to leave a real impact. It just needs a clear vision, strong performances, and the confidence to stay true to itself. Redefining the genre. Zooming out even further, one thing becomes unmistakably clear. This film isn't simply telling a Western story, it's quietly redefining what a Western can feel like. That's what gives it its distinct significance. At a time when many films in this genre leaned heavily on action and direct conflict, this one chose instead to slow down and focus on behavior, decision-making, and atmosphere, a choice that makes it stand apart even more clearly when set alongside its contemporaries. What's notable is that it doesn't reject the Western genre outright. It retains the core elements, land, rivalry, control, but presents them with far more thoughtfulness. The conflict is still there, but it's never treated as something that can be resolved through force alone. Instead, it becomes a lens for examining how different people think and respond under pressure. William Wyler's direction plays a central role in shaping this identity. He never chases convention, and that confidence lets the film remain consistent from start to finish. Even during its slower stretches, it never feels like the story is losing its grip, because every scene serves a clear purpose. The performances remain among the film's strongest assets, especially Gregory Peck, whose calm, steady presence carries the film without ever needing a dramatic showcase. Charlton Heston provides a sharp contrast, embodying a more traditional style, and that difference between the two creates a balance that keeps the story compelling throughout. Compared to more action-driven westerns, the distinction becomes even more apparent. Those films often depend on brisk pacing and clearly defined conflict, while this one builds everything slowly, prioritizing character and atmosphere over spectacle. That doesn't make it better or worse, it simply makes it distinctly its own. The cinematography reinforces this approach through its thoughtful use of space. The wide landscapes aren't there purely for visual appeal, they generate a sense of distance and isolation that mirrors the characters' emotional states. Jerome Ross's score adds to this identity as well, giving the film a unique sonic signature without ever overwhelming the scenes it supports. Another notable aspect is how the film handles conflict without rushing toward resolution. It lets situations develop naturally, which makes the eventual outcome feel far more earned. This does require patience from the audience, but it also makes the payoff considerably more satisfying. The film's themes hold up especially well viewed through this lens. The notion that strength doesn't always have to be loud or aggressive feels particularly resonant when set against other films in the same genre. The supporting characters add to this depth too, representing different sides of the conflict without ever becoming one-dimensional. Each feels like a genuine part of a larger world rather than a mere narrative device. From a production standpoint, the film demonstrates just how powerful a clear creative vision can be. It doesn't try to include everything, it uses what it has with real precision. The pacing remains one of its most distinctive qualities, and while it may not appeal to every viewer, it's central to what makes the film so singular. The more you reflect on it, the more the film feels less like a conventional Western and more like a character study set within that genre's framework, a combination that gives it real staying power, and one that highlights how the film manages to honor its genre while simultaneously expanding its boundaries. Hidden layers. Looking closely at some of the film's smaller details reveals just how much meaning is tucked into moments that might initially seem simple. This is where the film becomes even more compelling. It isn't just telling a story on the surface, it's quietly layering in additional depth beneath it. These details are never explained outright, but once you notice them, they reshape how you experience the entire film. One of the most striking choices is the film's use of silence. Many scenes feature very little dialogue, yet those quiet moments often carry more weight than lengthy conversations. This is entirely intentional. William Wyler leans on this technique to keep the tone controlled while still letting emotion surface naturally. Gregory Peck's performance grows even more impressive when viewed through this lens, since he rarely relies on dialogue to convey his character. Most of his performance comes through small gestures, pauses, and the way he reacts to unfolding events, a style of acting that demands real restraint and suits the film's overall tone perfectly. Charlton Heston, meanwhile, brings a more visible, direct presence, and the contrast between the two men remains one of the film's strongest elements, illustrating two entirely different ways of handling conflict without ever needing to explain them outright. Another hidden layer emerges in how the land itself is portrayed. It isn't merely a setting, it represents control, power, and even identity for these characters. The Big Muddy in particular becomes a symbol of everything they're fighting for, and everything they refuse to let go of. The cinematography reinforces this by consistently emphasizing the land's scale, while also highlighting the distance between characters even when they're physically close. The framing often makes them feel separated, echoing the emotional gulf between them. Jerome Ross's score adds to this layer too, enhancing the atmosphere without ever drawing attention to itself, giving the film its own identity while letting quieter moments stand on their own. There's also an interesting detail in how the film approaches conflict resolution. It never relies on a single moment to resolve everything. Instead, it builds toward a point where the characters begin grasping the consequences of their actions, and that understanding ultimately matters more than any outright victory. Compared to more conventional storytelling, where everything resolves quickly and cleanly, this approach feels different, but far more realistic. It mirrors how change often unfolds gradually in real life rather than all at once. The supporting characters contribute to these hidden layers too, each representing a distinct perspective. None of them feel superfluous, and even the smaller roles add to the overall texture of the story. From a production standpoint, the film shows how much of a difference careful attention to detail can make. Nothing feels random, and every element, from the setting to the performances, works in service of the larger story. The pacing plays a major role in how these details register, since the film's unhurried rhythm gives the audience time to notice and absorb these smaller touches. The more you think about the film, the more it feels like something that keeps revealing itself. It isn't just about what happens, it's about how it's presented. That's what makes it not only strong on the surface, but genuinely rich in detail underneath. Takeaways: stepping back and considering everything the film has shown, it starts to feel less like a simple story and more like an experience that slowly accumulates meaning over time. This is where the film becomes even more compelling. It isn't just about what happens, it's about what you personally take from it. Different viewers will likely walk away with different impressions, and that variation is part of what gives the film its depth. One of its biggest takeaways is how it portrays strength. Throughout the story, you see different versions of it, from dominance and control to patience and restraint, and by the end, it's clear that strength isn't confined to a single form. This idea is never forced on the audience, it's simply shown through the characters and their choices. Gregory Peck's performance plays a major role in conveying this, since his character stays consistent from start to finish. He never adapts to fit the world around him, and that consistency becomes his defining strength. Charlton Heston, by contrast, represents a more traditional approach, and the tension between the two continues to drive the story forward. William Wyler's direction ensures these ideas come through naturally. The film never feels like it's trying to teach a lesson, it simply presents different perspectives and lets the audience decide what to take away. Another key takeaway is how the film approaches conflict itself. Rather than focusing purely on outcomes, It emphasizes process A, showing how characters react and how their decisions shape events. This makes the story feel more realistic, since it's concerned not just with what happens, but with why it happens. The cinematography continues reinforcing these ideas by using space and distance to reflect the characters' emotional states. The wide landscapes aren't merely visual flourishes, they're woven into the storytelling itself. Jerome Ross's score adds to this experience by striking a tone that feels both grand and controlled, enhancing the film without ever pulling attention away from the story. From an audience perspective, the film offers a different kind of engagement. It doesn't rely on constant action to hold your interest, instead asking you to observe and reflect, which can be more rewarding for certain viewers. The pacing, which might feel slow initially, becomes essential to how the story is experienced, giving the characters time to develop and the audience time to connect with them. Another notable quality is how much the film respects its audience. It never over-explains, and it never forces a single interpretation. This makes the experience feel more personal, since each viewer can take away something different. The supporting characters reinforce this depth as well, representing distinct perspectives without being reduced to simple archetypes, which adds to the overall richness of the story. Reflecting on the film as a whole, its real strength lies in how it combines all these elements into something that feels genuinely complete. It's not just about the plot, it's about how everything works together, and that's exactly what makes this film so meaningful beyond mere entertainment, giving it a lasting impact. A complete experience. By this point in the discussion, the film feels fully realized, not just in terms of story, but in everything it set out to accomplish, since it never loses its grip on tone or direction. That consistency becomes one of its greatest strengths. What makes this especially compelling is that the film never tries to impress through obvious means. It keeps things simple, but that simplicity is carefully engineered. One thing that stands out clearly is how the film builds its impact through accumulation rather than isolated moments. It isn't about a single big scene or major twist, but about how each piece adds to the next, forming a complete experience by the end. This kind of storytelling demands patience, but it also builds a stronger connection with the audience. Gregory Peck's performance remains central to this effect, since his character carries the same calm, controlled presence throughout the film. There's no sudden shift, no forced transformation, just a steady, natural progression that makes his journey all the more believable. Charlton Heston, meanwhile, provides a contrast that helps define the conflict more sharply, his character embodying a more traditional idea of strength, and this difference between the two remains one of the story's key elements. William Wyler's direction ensures all these pieces come together seamlessly. There are no unnecessary distractions, and every scene feels purposeful. The cinematography reinforces this by using space and framing to keep the focus on the characters while still conveying the sheer scale of their surroundings. The wide landscapes remain important throughout, but they're always tethered to the story itself. Jerome Ross's score adds to the overall tone without ever overpowering it, supporting the emotional beats while letting the quieter scenes stand on their own. Another important quality is how the film leaves room for interpretation. It never tries to explain everything or push a specific message, which lets the audience engage with it on their own terms and makes the whole experience feel more personal. The steady pacing that's carried through the entire film continues to play a key role here too, letting everything develop naturally without ever feeling rushed or incomplete. The supporting characters contribute to this sense of completeness as well, each one feeling like part of a larger world rather than mere background presence, reinforcing the story's overall realism. As everything comes together, the film feels like it's achieved exactly what it set out to do. It's explored its themes, developed its characters, and maintained its tone without ever losing focus. There's also a sense that the film isn't offering a final, definitive answer. It's presenting a perspective, showing different ways of thinking and letting the audience decide what to take from it. From today's vantage point, This approach might feel unusual compared to faster-paced films, but that's exactly what makes it stand out, setting up a conclusion that ultimately feels natural and complete. Final thoughts: by the time you reach the very end of this journey, the film doesn't feel like something that simply told a story and wrapped up. It feels like something that stayed faithful to its vision from start to finish, and that's precisely what makes it endure. Even after everything has been said and considered, it doesn't rely on sudden shocks or dramatic endings. Instead, it leaves you with a quiet understanding that builds gradually over time. What strengthens this final impression is how everything connects when you consider the film as a whole. The characters, the environment, the conflict, even the pacing, it all works in concert in a way that feels genuinely deliberate. Nothing feels out of place, and nothing feels forced, which is no small achievement. Mackay's journey feels complete, not because it follows a conventional arc, but because he stays true to himself throughout. From the beginning, he embodies a different kind of strength, and by the end, that idea is fully understood. Gregory Peck carries the role with a performance that stays steady and natural, making the character feel authentic across the entire film. Charlton Heston, meanwhile, provides a strong counterpoint, embodying a more dominant, traditional approach. The balance between these two men is one of the key reasons the story feels so grounded. It never tries to oversimplify the conflict between them. William Wyler's direction remains the element that ties everything together. His ability to maintain a clear tone and sense of focus throughout the film is what gives it its lasting strength. The cinematography stays one of its defining features, using wide landscapes to convey both scale and emotional distance. The environment isn't just a backdrop, it feels like part of the story itself. Jerome Ross's score enhances this experience further, supporting the tone without ever overtaking it, giving the film its own identity while still letting its quieter moments shine. Another important quality is how the film respects its audience throughout. It never tries to over-explain or push a specific message. Instead, it invites viewers to observe and interpret for themselves, which makes the whole experience feel more engaging. From a production standpoint, the film illustrates just how effective a clear vision can be when executed well. It doesn't lean on complexity, it uses its elements in a way that feels genuinely complete. The pacing, which might feel slow to some viewers, becomes one of the film's greatest assets once you see how it lets everything unfold naturally, giving the story room to breathe and making the whole experience more immersive. The supporting characters play their part in this sense of completeness too, each one contributing to the story without ever feeling superfluous, a balance that helps maintain the film's overall consistency. In the end, the film leaves you with a feeling rather than a statement, and that, more than anything else, is what makes it linger long after the credits roll.